We're now up to Daf Lamed Zayin Omid Beis, and the Gemara was wondering at the bottom of Lamed Zayin Omid Aleph about Mudbaz HaMelech. Why is it that he contributed for the Yados HaKelim, for the handles of the Kelim to make them gold, but not the Kelim themselves? Omar Abaye Biyodos Sakinim. As far as the blade of a knife, it's not very functional if it's made out of gold. There has to be a certain amount of flexibility, so to speak. And in the case of these knives, what Mudbaz HaMelech did was he contributed beautiful handles for the knives. And the beauty of a knife is really in its handle. And it was made of gold. Masechet, the Gemara is going to quote a brisa now to prove that there were many kelim which Mudbaz had made out of gold. It doesn't seem like it was limited just to the handles. Afhu asa kane kelim, the ogne kelim. So the ogne kelim are what you use to grip the kelim, and the kane kelim are the base. The base of the kelim is called kane kelim. The yadot kelim, the yadot sakinim, and all the above for the sake of Chal Yoma Kippurim, Shel Zav, he made it out of gold. We see that Mudbaz's contribution was not just limited to the handles and to knives, but he made other utensils, and the utensils themselves were made out of Zav. And we find here on the list, we have Kane Kelim, Ogne Kelim. So Abaye answers, Targuma Abaye, when it says Yodos Sakinim, which are the handles of these knives, and then it says Yodos Kelim, the handles of utensils, Bekatota Denarge Vechatzine. He was referring to the handles of different types of axes and adges. These are kelim that cannot be made of zav, because although these kelim, like axes, were used on Yom Kippur to chop up the parts of the animal after the shechita, but that's only as far as the handles are concerned. But the keli itself cannot be made of gold. So now it would seem that Abaye has defended himself as far as the inclusion here of the brisa of Yodos Kelim. And of course, Yodos Sakim goes without saying. But if Mudbaz made not only those out of gold, but also Kane Kelim, the Ogne Kelim, these bases and grips of other types of utensils were made out of gold, so why did he make the kelim themselves out of gold? The Gemara doesn't seem to address that answer. It's addressed by the Tosi Shonim, Tosi Rosh, and they say that there's a fundamental difference between the bases and the grips and the handles. It's perfectly normal to make a keli out of gold and then make the grips or the bases out of some inferior material, such as silver. And therefore, it's very possible that in this brisa, with regard to Kane Kelim and Ogne Kelim, Enochinami, the Kelim themselves were made of gold, and Mudbaz, upgraded the base of the Keli, or the grip of the Keli, and made it out of gold as well, even though it was quite normal, quite popular and common to make the grips and the bases out of an inferior quality, like silver, but nevertheless, Mudbaz, upgraded it and made it the base and the grips out of gold. In the case of the handle of a kli, where the yad, the handle, is itself the essence of the kli, like the beauty of the kli aesthetically, if in the bigdash the kli itself was made of gold, it would be very unusual to say that the handle, which is the beauty of the kli, was made of an inferior material. So if before Mudbaz the handles were not made of gold, then presumably neither were the utensils. Whereas in contrast, the case of the utensils with bases and grips, it's very possible that the kalim themselves were made out of gold, the grips and the bases were made out of some inferior metal like silver, and Munbaz upgraded the status of the base and the grips and made it into gold. And that's why there's no contradiction to Abai's statement here regarding Munbaz in the cases of Yodos, Knei Kalim, and Ogne Kalim. Now the Mishnah said that Hilenia Imo Asasa Nivreshet Shel Zov, and this golden candelabra that she placed over the entrance to the Heichal would reflect the sun. Tana, we learned in the Brisa B'Shosha Chamaz Orachas, when the sun came out in the morning, and it's shown, is Nitzotzos Yotzim Mimena. There was reflected light that would radiate from the menorah on top of the Pesach HaHeichal, which she had contributed. So the first rays of sun could be seen in the Pesach of the Heichal on the Marav, on the west side. Vakol Yodim, and this would be like an announcement, they didn't have clocks in those days, Sheigia Zman Kriyat Shema, that it's now the time for Kriyat Shema. Meisvei, we want to analyze who was outside the Heichal and the Azara that needed to know what time is the time for Kriyat Shema. We have a brisa that says Kriyat Shema Shachris, with regard to Shachris Kriyat Shema. If he reads it im Anshe Mishmar, or for that matter with Anshe Mamad, Lo Yotza. Why? Mipnei Anshe Mishmar Mashkimim, Anshe Marav Miachmim. Therefore, it would seem that in the Azara, you fit into one of two categories. Either you were there because you were one of the members of the Anshe Mamad, and the Anshe Mamad used to come later after the early time for Kriyat Shema, because they were waiting until after the Avodah, the Tamid. So although they would recite Kriyat Shema before the end of Zman Kriyat, to the end of the third hour, however, they wouldn't negate a Torah commandment like Kriyat Shema, but nevertheless, they did not read Kriyat Shema with daybreak. They waited till after the service of the Tamid. And if that be the case, then the service of the Talmud would end, let's say, at the end of the second hour, third hour, but sometime before the end of the third hour, and that's when they would recite Kriyat Shema. They didn't need this sign of daybreak. The other members of the community that found themselves in the Azor were the Anshe Mishmar, meaning the Kohanim who were on duty. And the Kohanim who were on duty would recite Kriyat Shema very, very early. Too early for the Zman of Kriyat Shema. And the reason for that is because they felt that once they start the Avodah and they're on Mishmar, they're on duty, they may not get around to recite Kriyat Shema. So they recited Kriyat Shema before they started their Avodah at the beginning of the day. So they read Kriyat Shema earlier. Amar Abaye, you know why we gained from this announcement, so to speak, of daybreak for Kriyat Shema? It's because L'shar Amad Yerushalayim. And that means that not only was the Azara occupied by the Anshe Mishmar and the Anshe Mamad, but there were also people who didn't come for the Avodah. They didn't belong neither to the Anshe Mishmar nor to the Anshe Mamad. But nevertheless, they showed up in the Azara at the beginning of the day, and they needed to know exactly what time is Kriyat Shema. The Mishnah says, "V'afi osa tavla." She also contributed a tablet upon which the section called Megillah Sota, the Parsha of Sota, was inscribed on this tablet. And the Gemara says, "Shema Minah Kosu Megillah Tinok L'Slamidba." What is this all about? There's a machlokes in the Gemara in Gittin on Daf Samach as to whether or not you're allowed to write part of the Torah, committed to writing. And it all depends on whether Torah Megillah Nitnes, or the Torah was given all at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life in one fell swoop. Now, our Mishnah says that Heleni wrote a portion of Sota on this golden tablet. And let's derive from that you've got to submit a document in writing. And if you have to write on that document a section of the Torah, you're allowed to do so. And this would explain why we would be allowed to write sections of the Torah on a cloth in order to teach children. The Aleph Beis. He says, no. You cannot prove from this Mishnah that you're allowed to write segments of the Torah on a cloth, because in truth, you're not allowed to write segments of the Torah on the cloth unless you use what's called the Aleph Beis method, which means that you only begin with the first letter of each word that you're writing. And hopefully the person who's reading it will understand what should have come beyond that letter. So if this be the case, then even though you're not allowed to write a portion of the Torah, but here you can circumvent that Isur by writing Aleph Beis. Meisvei, the Gemara raises the following objection from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Kshu Kosei, when the Kohen writes the section of Parshas HaSota, and this is all part of the procedure necessary to be mashke the sota, test her out with mei marorim, is ro'av v'kosei mashakosei b'tavla. He looks at the tavla and he copies over whatever he saw in the tavla. Now, it seems here that the words themselves were inscribed on the tavla, because otherwise, what does it mean? Ro'av v'kosei mashakosu. The Gemara answers, "Ema ro'av v'kosev k'moshe kosev b'tavla." Doesn't mean that he looked at the tavla and he wrote the entire section of the Torah, full words, but really what it means is that he wrote it in the way it was written on the tavla. He saw it in the way it was written on the tavla with the Aleph Beis system, and then from the Aleph Beis he understood what would be the word that he had to write. He wrote out the entire word. Basically, but we'll ask you another kasha from a different brisa. Shu kosev, ro'ev kosev mashakosev b'tavla. He should take a look at the tavla, and he should write exactly what he sees in the tavla. Umashakosev b'tavla, ma kosev b'tavla. Im shachav ish osach, v'im lo shachav ish osach. Im satis, im lo satis. Once again, we can derive from this brisa that all the words, the actual words of Parshas Sota, were inscribed in the tablet. And when he looks at the tablet, the brisa tells us, he inscribes on the tablet. He writes, copies that which is inscribed on the tablet. And what's on the tablet? If shachav ish, it would indicate full words, not Aleph Beis. So Gemara rejects this and says, Hassam, there in the Brisa, that this tavla was beserigen on the top of Daf Lamed Ches, with alternate words. In other words, the beginning of each passage was fully inscribed, but the remainder of the passage was inscribed in an alphabet, Aleph Beis form. So the tablet began with Im Lo Shachav, but with only the first letter of each subsequent word until the end of that pasuk. At the beginning of the next pasuk was written the At Kisatis, and in event that you strayed, and the remaining of the pasuk is written in abbreviated form. So then Yitein Hashem Osach, it says that God will give you the remainder is abbreviated. And then finally it says Ubo Hamayim, with the remainder abbreviated. And this leads up to the sugya of the great miracles with regard to Nicanor and the Delasos Shari Nicanor of the Azor, which Shem will pick up tomorrow.